We will be discussing a theme that's been running throughout on South-South cooperation. We've discussed how the Global South's emergence now means that they need to be the incumbents and they need to take ownership of multilateral processes. And how do we do that will be the topic of the next conversation. On the panel would be Luciana Muniz, Project Director at the Brazilian Center for International Relations, my colleague from ORF, Malancha Chakravarti, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director for Research, Jose Alvarez, the Coordinator for International Organizations and G20 Committee at the Argentine Council of International Relations, and of course our co-host, Max Bokwana, from the Chief Executive Officer at the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, moderated by Bonolo Magele, Program Manager, Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. If I could request the panelists and the moderator to join us on stage. Bonolo, if I can hand it to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our panelists. As the moderator has said, in this conversation, we are going to look at diminishing the distance within the Global South. And we'll also reflect on the fact that the Global South as a geopolitical and geo-economic player has been underpinned by successive G20 presidencies from Indonesia, India, Brazil, and South Africa having to take over. So in this conversation, and maybe just to help us as an appetizer, I was going to give you 1 minute. So maybe I'll give Luciana Mulunchi and Jose 1 minute and Max 4 minutes that he requested to reflect on this idea that why is it important both symbolically and practically to reflect on this idea of diminishing geographical distances or diminishing distances within the Global South? Just a minute.
Hello. Hi. Well, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to start with a big thanks to the organizers for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today representing the Brazilian Center for International Relations, SEBRI, and it's a pleasure to be sharing the panel with my colleagues. I think we need to face that geography matters. But more than that, we need to work on cooperation level. We need to join efforts to make our Global South priorities and agendas to move on the next G20 priorities. So if, in a way, geography matters, we also need to put some of our differences aside and try to move together in a coordination and a cooperation way.
Hello. It's a pleasure to be here in Cape Town, and thank you so much. I think geography matters, maybe, but our struggles matter more. And there may be differences, but I think there are more similarities. And it is these similar struggles which make it imperative for us to work together. It is 2024, so many years after the whole world committed to making this world a better place. First time we had universal goals for the whole world. The North and the South both agreed that we need one set of goals for everyone. It's time that we remind ourselves and we don't forget the historic, the landmark achievement that it was. And we are today in not very happy times. About 868 million people in Africa are currently suffering from food insecurity. We, of course, have millions of people who are also ravaged by war globally. We have a situation where poverty has increased for millions of households. And many of the progress, the development outcomes that we achieved in early 2000s, from 2000 to 2010, have regressed. I think that provides the greatest reason for us to work together and not let anything matter more than these common struggles that the Global South faces.
Thank you.
Hello? Yes. Well, first off, thank you to ORF and to the Thabo Mbeki Foundation for hosting us, and also to Kari, whom I'm representing at this point. I would like to agree with what Malancha and Luciana were saying. Geography matters, but what's more important is to put our differences aside and to work together for common struggles. In that sense, one of the main achievements of the Brazilian G20 presidency, which was the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, is definitely a milestone. What we can differ about is which are the best policies. That is why the Global Alliance has a policy basket. Some may be more effective, such as market-driven or market-facing approaches, but definitively all of the policies matter. And to look forward to these common struggles, we have to go towards consensus, and that is definitely the basis of the G20. We have to make sure that the diminishing distances are reflected in diminishing conflicts between ourselves, and that consensus remains the core value of the G20 as it has from its beginning. Thank you.
Bonola, thank you very much. I suspect that what we require from these various panels as we talk about what will be South Africa doing, what will G20 doing, I think my warning is that the key thing, we must manage our expectations. I think our expectations are a bit exaggerated. I am a bit cynical, and I think there are reasons to be cynical. In June 2002, this discussion that is taking place here was taking place in Canada. And everything else that the minister and the presidency was raising was something that was discussed in Canada. The issue of partnerships, the issue of repatriation of stolen money from Africa in particular, the issue of capital flights, so the issue of poverty, and a number of these matters, and including the issue of accountability and good governance in our continent. It's many years later, we're still struggling with those issues. These issues were repeated in the various Doha development rounds, exactly the same way in ensuring that the countries of the South, the developing countries and the least developed countries are actually put in a better pedestal as far as the world trade is concerned and financing is concerned. That project was abandoned. Recently, we have the SDGs. If you just take one, the issue of poverty. By 2015, we were talking about 700 million people that are hungry. Today, we're talking about 723 million people that are hungry. We've just got 5 years or so to reach 2030. We have had COP26 and COP29. Exactly the same issues of just transition and issues of funding have been raised in Paris. They were raised in Baku last week. We still have not resolved those issues. We are sitting here again, repeating exactly the same agenda. I suspect the question that must be answered in the room here, what happens, what made all of these undertakings and commitments to fail? And I think that's the most important question that we must answer. And what do we do going forward to make sure that we do not fail? And what are the accountability methods that we put in place so that those that have made commitments meet with those commitments? So that's really where my cynicism starts, but at the same time where I'm saying the biggest challenge for us is to be able to respond to those issues. The net result is that there are two fundamental issues that are glaring in the developing countries or underdeveloped countries, in particular Africa, is the issue of poverty. If there's any one thing that we should be dealing with on the agenda is how do we eradicate poverty. But because of this distance that is big, the issue of poverty is exacerbated by the issue of debt burden.
Pramax, maybe as a follow-up question then, rightfully so that we have been having these conversations, right? And so how do we, in the most practical way, how do we ensure that we move from a place where we don't just have pretty policies, but there seems to be a problem somewhere, there seems to be, you know, an implementation gap of some sort. So as we reimagine the future, what is it actually that we then need to do to ensure that we don't have this conversation again in the next couple of years, and we don't have these pretty policies that are really not, resulting into anything sustainable? And if you can help us reflect on the seeming implementation gap that is there.
Well, no, I'm thinking, as far as our continent is concerned, there's a section in the Agenda 2063 that deals with the flagship projects. If we can just do one thing in the Sub-Sahara and say, can we have a conversation about the building of the Great Inga hydroelectric scheme? And that's it. And focus everything on that, because that's what is going to fuel development. That's what's going to make sure that there's proper energy in the region. That's what's going to help us to industrialize and manufacture. If you go to Mauritania and Senegal, there's an outstanding development of the GTA deep port to be able to facilitate trade in that region. If we can say then on the Sahel region, let's focus on that GTA. If you look at the Maghreb, there's an outstanding Maghreb transnational transport project. If we're able to undertake that, where you will be able to link Tunisia, link Egypt, link Morocco, and all of the countries in the Maghreb region, that will facilitate infrastructure development in the area. There's an East Africa railway corridor. So I'm saying if you take just these 4 practical projects of infrastructure and say we'll do nothing else in the next 10 years, but we focus simple on these projects, you will see what they do with the development and what they do with employment and dealing with poverty.
Thank you. And maybe let me bring Jose here then. Given that South Africa is taking over the G20 presidencies, right? So what are some of the key areas you would want to see South Africa focus on? But also this idea that how can South Africa take from what has been done by Indonesia, India, and Brazil and almost institutionalize it? So that's the starting point, reflecting on what has been done by Indonesia, India, and Brazil, and codify some of the gains that are there and institutionalize them. But moving forward, what are some of the G20 methods and really important specific key areas that you would want South Africa to focus on?
Thank you for that question, Bonolo. Going back to what I was saying earlier, I think the main learning that we have from the past 3 presidencies is the importance of consensus. Indonesia could have easily gone a different route, but they didn't. I was a bit concerned yesterday when I heard a suggestion in the ministerial address of modifying the consensus for a sufficient consensus. And we all know that that would have led to the dismemberment of the G20 in several occasions in its history if it had been followed. During the first Trump presidency, we had to, during the German, Argentine, and Japanese presidencies, we had to accommodate the positions of one country regarding the Paris Agreement situation, and we had to put specific paragraphs within the leaders' declaration to be able to reach that consensus. That was a hard negotiation, but it was well done, well managed in several presidencies. And Indonesia did the same during the 2022 presidency. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it would have been easy to take a majority standpoint versus the point of some other members in the G20, but the navigation and the negotiations were able to arrive at a language that was consensus-based. So I think going forward for South Africa would be very important to maintain that principal core value of the G20 as it has always been, and because it also guarantees one of the other core pillars of the G20, which is the equal footing of all of its members, especially when we're talking of a forum where obviously Europe is overrepresented and some of the global south areas are underrepresented. Fortunately now we have the African Union as well, and we welcome them there. One of the things that, going in line with what Max was saying, that could bring the African Union to have more engagement, in my view, would be if South Africa posts the possibility for them to co-chair some of the task forces that they've been thinking of setting up. I believe that the task forces on economic growth and artificial intelligence, as well as food security, are going to be crucial. I believe in line with Agenda 2063, as Max was saying, probably the first two would be interesting for the African Union to co-chair. And regarding artificial intelligence, I think it would be important to not go with a regulation-first approach, but rather to go with a more evidence-based approach. In what sense? Regardless of the discussion on big tech, which we've already heard of today in the DPI panel, we have to watch what the situation is in the countries and blocs that have tried to regulate before artificial intelligence actually deployed itself in a full fashion. We have the EU that's trying to see how they can redraft or reverse what they've done. In the case of the US, we can see what already happened in the space of blockchain technology and crypto economy, what generally happens with all disruptive technologies, right? Back in 2012, New York was a hotbed of blockchain activity, but then the regulators decided to go with the BitLicense project, and suddenly New York was devoid of any blockchain capacity. Everyone moved out, either to countries of the global south that were more welcoming and more embracing of these technologies and that actually solved the day-to-day problems of users in the global south, or they moved to different jurisdictions even within the US. The counterpoint is Wyoming, which, being the least populous US state, suddenly has over 3,000 companies because they were crypto-friendly in their legislation. They went for an evidence-based approach, and as the technology was developing, the legislation started coming out to accompany that evolution. So in that sense, another thing that was done in Indonesia is the establishment of the Digital Economy Working Group, and the task force that's going to be, that was already announced by South Africa and included in the Rio Declaration, is going to report to that working group. So I think that maintaining the focus on digital economy and artificial intelligence, but again, not in a regulation-first approach, but rather an evidence-based approach after the fact and accompanying the evolution of these new disruptive technologies is what South Africa could do best. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Luciana, building on what Jose just said, perhaps help us reflect, some of the gains some of the stuff that he has reflected on, but if there are other gains that we have seen throughout the G20 presidencies of the Global South, and how do we ensure that we don't lose that? Because after South Africa, it's moving to the Global North. So how do we ensure that there's continuity and some of the agendas that the Global South had focused on, we don't lose that when there's the transition into the Global North?
Hello. Thank you for the question. And I think to begin, I would like to take a little step back and reflect on the slogans that have defined the previous G20 presidencies. And I don't know if everyone here remembers, but in 2022, in Indonesia, we had Recover Together, Recover Stronger. Last year, India came up with One Earth, One Family, One Future. This year, the Brazilian slogan was Building a Just World and a Sustainable Planet. And South Africa is coming with solidarity, equality, and sustainability. There are very inspiring words and ideas, but we are still struggling to recover. And the concept of polycrisis is increasingly shaping our daily lives and risking our future, our families, and our planet. So I think while Brazil has made some strides, such as the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, and also advancing in other commitments like taxing the super rich and reforming global governance, I think the reality that we face is very far from achieving a just and sustainable world. And this gap feels even more pronounced in the light of the disappointment of COP29 last year. So I think there is still a lot to be done. And South Africa is bringing to the table two very important values to global South countries: solidarity and equality. I think we can all agree that achieving a sustainable planet and without addressing the inequalities and the challenges faced by developing countries like poverty, hunger, and the effects of climate change, the historical and underrepresentation of our countries in key multilateral global decision-making forums. I mean, we must address these topics, otherwise we won't reach a sustainable planet. So I think in this context, the G20, the T20, the other engagement groups can play a crucial role in ensuring Global South agenda, not only in this last presidency, but also in the upcoming one in 2026. So it comes to my mind 5 specific actions. The first one would be setting an agenda with very specific goals and real capacity to transform the G20 dialogues into implementation plans and clear actions for the future. My second point relates to leveraging the Troika support mechanism. I think South Africa not only holds the agenda-setting power for next G20 presidents, but can also count on the collaboration of the previous countries and hopefully the upcoming presidents as well. From a T20 perspective, we had the privilege to work very close with Indonesia, with India, with South Africa, and I think this kind of cooperation is very useful to maintain continuity into policy-making process. Also, from a T20 perspective, I think one of the things we did in Brazil was to foster collaboration in between global South countries, global North, as one of the requirements that we had to submission for the policy briefs. So we didn't accept any policy brief that wasn't written by at least 2 different institutions from 2 different countries. And I think the idea was to share knowledge, to share experience in the sense that the recommendations could reflect these challenges and these exchanges and joint solutions from different countries. My next point relates also to the strengthening of the engagement groups and the social G20 as structural tools. I think it would be important to keep these mechanisms to ensure deeper collaboration between engagement groups, between civil society, between the Sherpa and the finance tracks, in a sense that it helps to bridge high-level discussions with think tanks, with the academia, with the private sector, with the parliament, as some of the speakers mentioned yesterday. And this is quite important because it creates a powerful mechanism to link policy dialogues to real world and to implementation plans. And finally, I think it's also important to align global agendas across multilateral spaces. I think I'll stay here for now.
Thank you. So now that we've reflected on the G20 presidencies and some of the efforts that have been made, so I want to bring you there, and it goes back to where we started, this idea of diminishing, the geographical distances and what you reflected on that. Some of the things that we see the global south experience, some of these issues are transnational, right? And Bramek spoke about this idea that really poverty and hunger is one of our biggest things. So coming from India, perhaps if you can help us reflect on some of the development progress that India has achieved, and what are some of the areas in which the countries in the global south can learn from India, because most of countries on the global south are where India had been in the past. So if you can really tell us a developmental story of where India was and where it is, and what are some of the things that we can learn from India.
Thank you so much for that question. I think, way back in the 1960s, we started our ITech program, and the first development partnership initiative was within 2 years of Indian independence. So India started helping other developing countries even when it was finding its own feet and struggling with various development challenges on its own. And of course, we have come a long way. We have made major strides, particularly in eradicating absolute poverty, in eradicating hunger. And there definitely is a lesson for other countries there. We know what needs to be done. We know we need to improve the agricultural productivity. We know we need safety nets for our people. We need an effective public distribution system. India's own public distribution system has contributed immensely towards ameliorating hunger. So we know what needs to be done. We know we need to provide livelihoods. We need to provide livelihood security. We need to empower women. We need to empower communities to eradicate poverty. And some steps have definitely been taken by the Indian government's initiatives, particularly through the Lines of Credit program. And I think Africa is one of the biggest beneficiaries of them. A lot of the Lines of Credit projects have been implemented successfully in African countries, also in our neighboring countries. So we do believe that whatever little we have, we are willing and happy to share. That's the spirit of India's development cooperation program. Sharing our development experience and sharing whatever little we have through knowledge, through technical cooperation, and through concessional lines of credit, which we have done so far. But also now, looking at newer forms of cooperation, cooperating with other countries in third countries, going through the triangular format with many of the northern countries also. So in a nutshell, India is most happy not only to be just the voice of the global south, but also lend a helping hand and hold the hand, and together, address many of the collective problems that we continue to face.
Thank you. Bramex, I want to bring you here, and partly because you spoke earlier about, the African Union agenda, the Africa we want to see, right? And so, given that the African Union has a seat in the G20, I'm trying to be generous in the way in which I frame this question. How can we take the African Union seriously as a contributor? Will its input shape the outcome of the G20 deliberation? If the answer is yes, what does that look like? If the answer is no, why is that a problem? And I think we can all agree in this room that we've got a leadership challenge in the African Union. We can spend the whole day here having the conversation about some of really the challenges that we see in this institution. So I want you to really help us more critically that how can the African Union be taken seriously as a contributor, and do we see its input making a difference in the deliberations within the G20?
Bonola, thanks. I think the first thing we must take into account is that many of these multilateral institutions were built when Africa was just a footnote. And later on, Africa was just an invited guest, not sitting at the center of the discussions. I think the challenge we're having today is that Africa must not remain in the periphery. For it not to remain in the periphery, it's the work of leadership. You need quality, focused leadership to be able to do this. And that's the point you're making. It must be the leadership that takes itself serious. I've got a suspicion that the kind of leadership we've got at the AU and various of our countries is the leadership that they themselves don't take themselves serious. And I think as Africans, we need to make sure that we call for accountability when it comes to that. Many of you must have seen these embarrassing spectacles where 54 leaders will be invited by the Prime Minister of Italy. And they go, each one of them, greeting and presenting their case. From there, they go and ask for grain from President Putin, despite the fact that we've got so much land here to plow. Nobody is going to take people like that serious. So I think as African citizens, I think we must call for this seriousness in terms of the engagements. But at the same time, when AU has been invited in a platform like this, the AU is much more advanced than everybody else because they've got an African program. And that's the program that needs to be put on the table. And we must argue for partnership in the implementation of that program. But that can be done. That's a job of a serious leadership.
Thank you so much for that. I'm now going to open up a space to get questions from the audience. But before we do that, we have a former minister from India who would like to make an intervention. So I'm going to hand over to you, sir, to make your intervention before I open up space for the audience to ask a question.
No, I just want to make an intervention and will be happy to respond if there's any question. When you had asked what can India do, given its own experiences in development as far as sharing of technologies. An important thing concerning Africa was the Pan-African E-Network project, which was announced when our late president, who was a great scientist, Abul Kalam, had come here. It was in this continent that India launched it, gifted it, through our dedicated satellites. We linked the entire African continent. 49 countries had joined. It was a major leap, not only to bridge the digital divide, but linking major universities in all regions of Africa, not all the universities, and hospitals, with super specialty hospitals in India and major universities of India. And that was functional. Then finally, it was handed over to the AU. This is one area where, as the world is moving towards digitization, financial inclusion issues, perhaps we can work in partnership. Second area is directly what you were discussing. We have a payment system, payment gate, which is now globally, it has attracted global attention, the Roque. We're in dialogue with major countries, 30 countries, for the payment system on which There is no burden on the user at all, unlike all other payment systems. And this is something perhaps we should be put on the agenda, discussed, and we can work together.
Thank you, sir. Any question? Okay, it doesn't look like we have any questions in the room. So perhaps maybe I can ask each of the panelists to, for 2 minutes, what are some of the, recommendations and some of the ideas you would want this conversation to land at, that when we almost reimagine what, the Global South should look like for us, what should that look like, and what are some of the things you would want the audience to take home with? I'm going to start with you, Luciana.
Thank you. Yeah. I've been listening to Max very carefully since we were in the speaker's room. And what I feel like saying right now is actually my final remarks relates to this unique opportunity that South Africa leadership will have to advocate for Africa's development, for Africa's interests on the world stage. So I think if I can, by any chance, give a piece of advice, would be selecting key issues where you can make a significant impact to shape global policies and advance Global South and Africa integration and cooperation. Time flies. 1 year is not enough for everything that needs to be done. So I think it's important also to balance the immediate priorities with long-term goals. And I think you have really a unique opportunity to this leadership and to ensure that G20 remains a platform for inclusive, sustainable, equitable growth. And I wish you and my T20 from South Africa friends all the best, good luck, a successful leadership, and try to have some fun along the way as well.
Okay, I think this is an opportune moment for Africa. For a very long period of time, the G20 was taking decisions which affected Africa without any consultation to Africa. For instance, the DSSI and the Common Framework, completely without any inputs from Africa. So there is a very important opportunity to change that. We now have the African Union, and both South Africa during its presidency with AU's presence must ensure that it advances Africa's interest, it fights for its rightful share in the global economy, and it fights to, and I don't want to repeat the same thing which many speakers have said, the global financial institutions are inherently biased against African economies. They need a thorough reform. The current world order will not solve the grave challenges that we are going through. So there is a good opportunity which needs to be leveraged. And the Agenda 2063 is the master plan which Africa needs to work towards. So how can G20 be the platform to help Africa achieve Agenda 2063? And lastly, I just want to add to what Mr. Sharma has already said. He elaborately mentioned about the Pan-African e-network and spoke about the digital sphere. But taking from what Max said, because I was also listening very carefully to everything that he was saying, of course Africa can grow its own food. We learned to do that way back in the 1960s. And definitely we are happy to help. Food is not a commodity. Food is the basic essence of life. So every country must become food secure and every country must try to grow its own food. So India's experience with Green Revolution should be the bedrock of Africa trying to be food secure. I'll just close with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Wanolo. And just as a couple of conclusions from what we've been talking about, a little more generous than Max in this regard and without any moral authority since I'm not from the continent, I do believe that it's a bit of a learning curve to become a full-fledged member of the G20. And in that regard, I think South Africa, during this presidency, will have a bit of a moral duty to help guide the African Union as a full-fledged member. And I think they can do a lot to engage them within the current presidency. And secondly, regarding what we were talking about working methods, I believe that one of the Brazilian innovations that's also worthwhile to bear in mind and that South Africa has taken up is the fact of establishing one-year task forces, because there's a small issue with the development of the G20 throughout the years, and it's something that I have called on more than one occasion the inflationary inertia of every presidency trying to create its working group or its engagement group, if not more than one. And the G20 ends up becoming a behemoth that doesn't have a permanent secretariat, which is good. It allows the forum to retain flexibility that other organizations don't have. But the idea of establishing transitory task forces that don't necessarily crystallize into a working group or an engagement group is something that can help each yearly presidency to obtain the goals that it needs for the benefit of the whole grouping. Thanks.
Wanolo, thanks. I think what Minister was saying earlier on, I think it's important. I think one of the key things that is really possible and practical is for South Africa and the AU to coordinate cooperation much more amongst the countries of the Global South. There's a lot that we can pull together so that we don't sit in this forum as a complaint session against the developed countries. We've got within ourselves to be able to deal with the issues of technology as he has raised. We got within ourselves to be able to deal with this issue of food security. We need to sit amongst ourselves and say, what do we do with our critical minerals? And in that process, we are able to set this global agenda. So that's the first thing that I think it's a practical thing that we can do and do it as a domesticated rather than an imposed idea. The second thing, as I was saying at the beginning, really is to narrow this agenda. If we can narrow this agenda just on the eradication of poverty and say everything we are doing is to make sure that the poverty becomes the issue of the past. It's totally unacceptable that we've got these high levels of poverty in our continent and in the developing world. So then the third thing is there's a lot of intellectuals in the room. I think we need to sit in a forum like this and design and develop accountability measures so that it's clear that when our leadership gets involved in all of these things, what are the expectations from us as citizens and how are those expectations going to be met? And therefore, what it means is that as a group like the group that we have and Think 20 must remain engaged so that we don't turn these forums into elite forums where our leaders goes once a year. We need to understand what is the practical impact of all of these things on the daily lives of the masses of the Global South. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. So just to help us reflect on some of this key stuff that came out of this conversation, we started with this idea that geography matters, but more importantly, collaboration is important. And I think that's something that we need to think critically about. How do we very early on, as Pramex has just said, we coordinate strong collaborations with different players, but also this idea of a call for a new fabric of leadership, a leadership that really takes itself seriously, and also a call for strong accountability measures. Because if we appoint you and give power to you, then you owe us the right to account to us and adhere to principles of accountability and transparency thereof. But also the fact that this is an opportunity for Africa. This is an opportunity for Africa to use the G20 as a platform to achieve, the African Union agenda, the African Union 2063 agenda of an Africa that we want. So, yeah, thank you so much for helping us think through this conversation, and I hope that we can continue to have this conversation as the day progresses. Thank you.
Thank you to the moderator and to the panelists. If I can invite you to the top of the stage for a quick photograph. I think my big takeaway from this session was poverty must be a thing of the past. So thanks for that, Max. I think that's a good mission statement to chase. We will now break for about 15 minutes. And then we'll come back into this room. Please bring your tea and coffee. We'll have the one last closing plenary session on how to achieve peace. So we'll identify the pathways to achieving peace. And then we will, of course, hear from the Honorable Deputy President of South Africa deliver the valedictory address to all of us. Thank you so much. Bring your tea and coffee inside, and then we'll commence with chasing the pathways to peace and the valedictory.